Paths of Liberation. This simple truth, that the control of consciousness determines the quality of life, has been known for a long time. In fact, for as long as human records exist. The oracle's advice in ancient Delphi, know thyself, implied it. It was clearly recognized by Aristotle, whose notion of the virtuous activity of the soul in many ways prefigured the arguments in this book. And it was developed by the Stoic philosophers in classical antiquity. The Christian monastic orders perfected various methods of learning how to channel thoughts and desires. Ignatius of Loyola rationalized them in his famous spiritual exercises. The last great attempt to free consciousness from the dominion of impulses and social controls was psychoanalysis, as Freud pointed out. The two tyrants that fought for control over the mind were the id and the superego. The first a servant of the genes, the second a lackey of society, both representing the other. Opposed to them was the ego, which stood for the genuine needs of the self connected to its concrete environment. In the East, techniques for achieving control over consciousness proliferated and achieved levels of enormous sophistication. Although quite different from one another in many respects, the yogi disciples in India, the Taoist approach to life developed in China, the Zen varieties of Buddhism all seek to free consciousness from the deterministic influence of outside forces, be they biological or social in nature. Thus, for instance, a yogi disciplines his mind to ignore pain that ordinary people would have no choice but to let into their awareness. Similarly, he can ignore the insistent claims of hunger or sexual arousal that most people would be helpless to resist. The same effect can be achieved in different ways, either through perfecting a severe mental discipline, as in yoga, or through cultivating constant spontaneity, as in Zen. But the intended result is identical. To free inner life from the threat of chaos, on the one hand, and from the rigid conditioning of biological urges on the other, and hence to become independent from the social controls that exploit both. But if it is true that people have known for thousands of years what it takes to become free and in control of one's life, why haven't we made more progress in that direction? Why are we as helpless, or more so, than our ancestors were in facing the chaos that interferes with happiness? There are at least two good explanations for this failure. In the first place, the kind of knowledge or wisdom one needs for emancipating consciousness is not cumulative. It cannot be condensed into a formula. It cannot be memorized and then routinely applied. Like other complex forms of expertise, such as a mature political judgment or a refined aesthetic sense, it must be earned through trial and error, experienced by each individual, generation after generation. Control over consciousness is not simply a cognitive skill, at least as much as intelligence. It requires the commitment of emotions and will. It is not enough to know how to do it. One must do it consistently, in the same way as athletes or musicians who must keep practicing what they know in theory. And this is never easy. Progress is relatively fast in fields that apply knowledge to the material world, such as physics or genetics. But it is painfully slow when knowledge is applied to modify our own habits and desires. Second, the knowledge of how to control consciousness must be reformulated every time the cultural context changes. The wisdom of the mystics, of the Sufi, of the great yogis, or the Zen masters might have been excellent in their own time. It might still be the best if we lived in those times and in those cultures. But when transplanted to contemporary California, those systems lose quite a bit of their original power. They contain elements that are specific to their original context, and when these accidental components are not distinguished from what is essential, the path to freedom gets overgrown by brambles of meaningless mumbo-jumbo. Ritual form wins over substance, and the seeker is back to where he started. Control over consciousness cannot be institutionalized. As soon as it becomes part of a set of social rules and norms, it ceases to be the effective way in which it intended to be. Routinization, unfortunately, tends to take place very rapidly. Freud was still alive when his quest for liberating the ego from its oppressors was turned into a state ideology and a rigidly regulated profession. Marx was even less fortunate. His attempts to free consciousness from the tyranny of economic exploitation were soon turned into a system of repression that would have boggled the poor founder's mind. And as Dostoevsky, among many others, observed, if Christ had returned to preach his message of liberation in the Middle Ages, he would have been crucified again and again by the leaders of that very church whose worldly power was built in his name. In each new epoch, perhaps every generation, or even every few years, if the condition in which we live changed that rapidly, it becomes necessary to rethink and reformulate what it takes to establish autonomy and consciousness. Early Christianity helped the masses free themselves from the power of ossified imperial regime and from an ideology that could give meaning only to the lives of the rich and powerful. The Reformation liberated a great many number of people from the political and ideological exploitation by the Roman Church. The philosophers and later the statesmen who drafted the American Constitution resisted the controls established by kings, popes, and aristocracy. When the inhuman conditions of factory labor became the most obvious obstacles to the workers' freedom to order their own experience as they were in 19th century industrial Europe, Marx's message turned out to be especially relevant. The much more subtle but equally coercive social controls of bourgeoisie Vienna made Freud's road to liberation pertinent to those whose minds had been warped by such conditions. The insights of the gospel, of Martin Luther, of the farmers of the Constitution, of Marx and Freud, just to mention a very few of those whose attempts have been made in the West to increase happiness by enhancing freedom, will always be valid and useful. The insights of the Gospels, of Martin Luther, of framers of the Constitution, of Marx and Freud, just to mention a very few of those whose attempts had been made in the West to increase happiness by enhancing freedom, will always be valid and useful, even though some of them have been perverted in their application. But they certainly do not exhaust either the problems or the solutions. Given the recurring need to return to this central question of how to achieve mastery over one's life, what does the present state of knowledge say about it? How can it help a person to learn to rid himself of anxieties and fear and thus become free of the controls of society? How can it help a person to learn to rid himself of anxieties and fears and thus become free of the controls of society, whose rewards he now takes or leaves? As suggested before, the way is through control over consciousness, which in turn leads to control over the quality of experience. Any small gain in that direction will make a life more rich, more enjoyable, more meaningful. But starting to explore ways in which to improve the quality of experience, it will be useful to review briefly how consciousness works and what it actually means to have experiences. Armed with this knowledge, one can more easily achieve personal liberation.